Okay. For this next exercise, I will need you to raise your hand. How many of you read the news when you wake up in the morning? How many of you feel informed about the state of the world after reading the news? How many of you ever think about the stories that the media does not cover? About a year ago, I asked these very same questions in a library packed room during my thesis defense. When I asked the first two questions, many people raised their hands, just like you all today. However, fewer audience members raised their hands when I asked them if they ever thought about the stories they don't hear or read in the news. This reaction illustrated for me that not all the news readers thinks about the stories that do not get told. However, is every story left out just not important enough? Whose story gets told? My honors thesis, developed over a year, looked into this question. Why do some armed conflicts get more media coverage than others? Through this research, I dived into the ocean-deep world of news media and gained valuable lessons I want to share with you today. But do not worry. I will spare you the lessons about how procrastinating is not a good idea while writing a thesis. So for this research, I interviewed journalists coming from different parts of the world. They had experiences covering hidden and known conflicts, from the Iraq invasion to the South Sudan war. In each of the interviews, I asked two common questions. Number one, what are common characteristics of stories that receive a lot of attention? And number two, what are some challenges you have faced when covering conflicts? The centrality of the human angle was a common answer to my first question. You see, one of my interviewees told me that news readers, you all, cannot connect with 1,000 people, but those stories with one person will likely capture your attention. Another of my interviewees gave me an even more powerful example. In the year 2000, Mozambique experienced one of the worst floods of its history. 1/3 of the country went underwater. But natural disasters happen all the time, so why should we care? He told me. The story that drew attention to the Mozambique flood was that of a woman who had given birth on a tree. In the Western media, there was a micro story, a small story, a personal story of a woman who had given birth on a tree, and that was what sparked the conversations. Everyone was wondering, well, who is this woman? Did the baby survive? All the stories about the Mozambique flood shrunk to this minor story. If there was no baby born on a tree, would the media have covered the story of Mozambique? The answer is probably not. However, that would not have made the story any less important. The presence of human narratives are a good thing because it allows us to relate and to care. But we must take away this crucial insight. Not all stories will have a clear human angle as we like it. And so we must be willing to seek out the stories deemed too complex to be covered in the news. I decided to write my thesis on media coverage because of Tigray. I learned about Tigray through a college friend who came from the region. In November 2020, as the world turned its face to the United States elections, Tigray faced a genocidal war. The Ethiopian government's forces and other regional militias killed 600,000 people, displaced 2 million Tigrayans. and looted and destroyed hospitals, schools, and civilians' businesses. My question about why Tigray received so little attention became even more relevant when the Ukraine war broke out 2 years later. You see, the media's coverage of Ukraine was hard to miss, with some companies covering the news for days on end. And as the media covered the news more, you and the world paid more attention. As you see, Google search trends shows that between February 2022 and July 2023, the red line showing the search term for Tigray globally barely ever picks up. But Tigray and Ukraine were not very different. In both stories, civilians were killed, civilians were displaced, and their loved ones abroad worried about their fate. Tigrayans abroad were unable to talk to their families as Tigray was cut off from any communication, not knowing if their family members were still alive or if they were displaced. Of course, it's not a simple story. The Western governments had an interest in countering Russia, and that could explain a lot of why Ukraine got more coverage. Most of the stories I learned about Tigray, I learned from that friend and human rights organizations such as Omna Tigray or Human Rights Watch. The media's coverage of Tigray, or lack thereof, highlights that not each important story gets told. As one of my interviewees told me, we look at some parts of the world we take more seriously than others. We don't look at Africa or South America nearly carefully enough. We don't look at Myanmar, and we don't look at Afghanistan anymore, and he meant we in the West since the US left. However, we have a duty to care and to seek out those stories that are not told. And how do we do that? Well, first, we need to listen. I would not have learned about Tigray had I not listened to my friend. For all of you here and all of us in the world, we know neighbors, our classmates, our colleagues, who may be coming from parts of the world that are experiencing immense suffering right now. We must make space for those stories. To listen and to not stop there, we must ask them how we can support and take action. Now, do you remember the second question I asked? Well, what are some challenges you have faced when covering conflicts? Financial cost and accessibility to the news are two of those many challenges. Health insurance costs a lot in war zones. So more and more, insurance companies get to decide if a journalist is going to access a conflict zone and then if a story gets covered or not. So some stories only get covered if freelance journalists take on the financial risk and the personal risk to go in there and talk about those stories. As one of my interviewees told me, back in 2024, if you read any news coming from Syria or Libya, it most likely came from a freelance journalist because those conflicts cost a lot to cover. And so, modern day media's goal is the pursuit of profit. Every single day, media companies make financial decisions to make sure their businesses continue to grow, including deciding to not cover a story if the health insurance would just cost too much. Accessibility to the news is another barrier. One of my journalists told me that some conflicts are hard to cover because their front lines are constantly shifting and you can never know where the danger may be coming from. There are also threats of kidnapping that can prevent many journalists to access some of those areas. One of my interviewees covered the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s for 5 years. He had to walk across the mountains on foot and got really sick in the first 3 months because he was unfamiliar with the landscape and the language. He needed the help of the locals to get around. And as he argues, the current devastation in the Congo is also hard to cover because it's complicated to get around. So his advice was this: we need to pay more attention to local news because local journalists are better understanding of the cultures, the context, the decision-making processes that shape a lot of these stories. This lesson was emphasized for me when I studied abroad in Jordan in 2023. I took a class on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and my professor would make us do a weekly homework consisting of reading both local Israeli and Palestinian news and summarizing what we found. It was striking for me to see that there were continued Israeli airstrikes on Palestinian homes and illegal settlements that displaced Palestinians from their homes, but those stories were not covered in international news. However, the reality stands that even when freelance journalists take on the risks or when we do pay more attention to local news, one answer kept coming back after each of my interviews. Editors have the final say. One of my journalists spent months in Tigray trying to shed light on the horrors that were happening there. Bracing through fear and hunger, some nights he would hear the gunshots, knowing that death could be near. After all those months, he wrote his story and would send it to an international media company. Far away, an editor in England reads this submission while drinking coffee in the morning. After a brief read, they could decide that this story just does not cut it. It will not capture your attention. The news media's current structure, the industry exists such that the news have some presence in some places more than others, especially in developed countries. And so many of these journalists coming from the least developed countries will not have their stories covered most of the time. In this pursuit of gains that the media does today, every single day, editors are looking into ways to increase viewership and sales by taking into consideration your likes and dislikes, my likes and dislikes, to decide which stories get covered, where they are covered, and how they are covered. I have shared a lot with you all today. And right now, you might be wondering, why does this matter anyways? Newspapers, TVs, and all sorts of media can shape public opinion and mobilize mass action for social good. Media coverage can bring to our presence distant suffering and shed light on forgotten crises. When the media frames through a human rights lens, it can deter abusers from inflicting even more pain. For example, the coverage of the current devastation in Palestine, especially by local journalists like Bisan Auda, has mobilized people across the world to ask for a ceasefire and go even further to ask the governments to go and do diplomatic processes that will bring lasting peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So media coverage matters. If you forgot anything I said today, here's what I want you to remember. The media is not going to cover all stories that are important. And we have a duty to seek out those untold stories. The lessons I shared with you throughout this talk are the following. We need to make space for other stories. Listen to those around you, ask how you can be of help, and take action. Consider uplifting those organizations that are telling those untold stories by attending their webinars, sign up for their newsletters, volunteer, do anything that is in your capacity. Number 2, diversify your news outlets and especially read local news because local journalists have a better understanding of the context and oftentimes will cover those stories even when we don't see them in international news media. Finally, while I hinted at this towards the end of the talk, your homework when you step out of this room is to go and read about media framing. Coverage alone is good, but it is not enough. As I said, when the media frames around human rights abuses, it can deter abusers from inflicting even more pain. But the media frames stories in a way that turns the victims into the villains, in a way that upholds government foreign policy, then reality can be turned upside down. Being aware of how these concepts work will make you an even more powerful reader and citizen of the world. Finally, I want to be honest with you all. These lessons are hard to incorporate as habits. I did not know anything about media coverage or media framing before writing this thesis. And to this day, I still struggle to apply these lessons that I have learned. But one thing I know is when our perspectives shift, when you step out of Maconomy today, when you finish listening to this talk wherever you are in the world, you will see the world in a different lens. And that's how change happens, one step at a time. Peace is fragile. And nothing guarantees us that our current stability will be everlasting. The people going through oppression from Myanmar to Palestine, Congo to Sudan, did not choose to live a life of genocide or war. We have a duty to care, to uplift each other, to resist oppression. Peace everywhere is in our common interest because it's the only state in which we can continue to innovate, to drive change, and to reach our greatest human potential. Thank you.